Hello my friend, today I'm going to show you how I draw on a very bright paper. I use Canson Colorline fuchsia hue. Whenever I use it, it gives me fantastic results. Test your colors on a separate piece of paper to understand what colors are going to react to this paper and what colors are not gonna look very vivid. When doing this demonstration, I was actually testing out these colored pencils. You don't have to buy them. You can easily replace them with your brand. These are not the softest ones. And I have a basic color chart you can refer yourself to. I usually use a sketch paper to sketch out the face, and then I transfer it onto my drawing paper. I do this because I want my paper to be very nice and clean. It cannot stand graphite lines. Whenever you shade with light pencils, you make the lines much stronger, and it just contaminates the color. I always start drawing the same way. I mark the deepest shadows first, and then I mark the highlights. You know, the choice of my colored pencils for this depends on the image. Here I used black to mark the darkest areas, and I used Prismacolor white to mark the highlights. And black can be replaced with a very dark brown as well. So I have the two poles, the lightest lights and the darkest darks. Over the course of this video demonstration, I'm just gonna bridge the gap between these two extreme values. But before I do that, I always work on the eyes first because they are the focal point. And that's the reason why I fill them in first. Please refer to my previous videos how to draw the eyes to understand where to place shadows and the highlights in the eyes. I use a very sharp colored pencils because they allow for precision necessary to make very nice thin lines, and also I rotate my drawing often to make the strokes in the right direction. I'm adding a mix of light blue and light gray into the eyes. And now I'm rotating my panel and drawing out the irises, making sure that they're nice and even and circular. It is really important to make them look nice and even. You won't believe this, but a lot of times students draw their eyes that just don't look round enough. I touch up the lights and the highlights with white, and after that I continue shading with colors. And again, I pay attention to values. The corners of the eyes are much darker, and what I do, I pick one pencil, let's say like dark gray or dark brown, and shade all the areas that I see being dark. The upper eyelids pick up the highlights right where you draw your irises. and that's important to follow. So the eye is dark, light, dark, and that's how you make it look round. Whenever you shade the eyelids, pay attention to that. It's not a single value. It's very dark in the corner. You have the highlight in the middle of the eyelid, and then it gets a little bit darker once again. When I fill in the white area in the eye, it's not quite white. Usually it has a lot of color, and one part of the eye is almost always in the shadow. I look at my reference to see if this white leans towards yellow more or if it leans towards the blue more. And that's how I make my color choice when I shade this area. When I begin shading the lips, I always start from the corners of the lips. You could use a dark brown, or you could use a very dark reddish brown. It depends on your preference. In this case, this is dark reddish brown that looks very similar to Tuscan red in Prismacolorline. These corners in the lips are always the darkest, and they give the volume and shape to the lips. Also, notice how short my strokes are. A lot of times I use a circular stroke to make very soft shadows. After that, I mark my highlights on the lower lip, and after that, I can just pick the local color, reds that I see in the lips, and fill in the areas between this darkest red and the highlight. I use a combination of these two colored pencils to draw out the basic form shadow on the face where I see it, and also I use these colors to shade around the eyebrows, to make softer transitions, to put them into the face more, so they're more like part of the face. Because if you outline the facial features too much, it looks unnatural. And that's why it's important to go back and soften those outlines. And I basically use a lot of gray to define the deepest shadows that I see on the face. The ear needs to have the same colors that you use on the face. Most of the time, ears are very warm in terms of color, and that's why I use this reddish brown to define the shape of the ear first. Now I begin shading in large areas in the face, and I use this yellow ochre color to shade around the highlights. The picture has a lot of yellow in the skin tones, and that's the reason why I'm using it. Next, I get to the cooler parts of the face, and I use a combination of cool pink and cool gray to fill in the sections of the face that appear to be cooler. You know, it's important to create variations between warm and cool in the skin tones. The value might stay the same, And by value, I mean how light or dark the area is, but the color temperature shifts constantly in the face, and that's what I'm trying to capture. And also, it looks a lot more vibrant, creating this play between warm and cool colors. Okay, this is the place where I have my major shapes established and my major darks established, my major lights established. I began filling in the transitions between the darks and the lights. And I think this is the hardest part because I need to make soft and subtle transitions from the light into the shadow. And to do so, I need to use medium pencil pressure and a couple of colors to create those transitions. And as I'll continue shading, I will think of the volume and how I can create this volume with my pencil stroke direction. This means that, for instance, when I get to this shape, I shade this way, then I turn my pencil, I shade this way, then I turn my pencil, I shade this way. I also keep rotating my paper when I do so because it's a lot easier to shade in a particular direction. If I look at this space, I can shade this way and turn my pencil and shade this way and turn my pencil and shade this way. So I look at the anatomy and the curvature, at all the shapes to create this volume with pencil direction. If I look at this space, it basically goes up and curves in and curves out. And I'm creating this with the highlights, but I also would watch for my pencil direction to make different strokes. For instance, shading like this, shading like this, shading like this, shading like that. If I look at this space, I'm gonna continue shading this way, then I would change pencil direction and I would shade this way. I would change pencil direction and I would shade that way. If I look at this space, again, this is round, so it curves. While I have this basic core shadow established, and I have this basic reflected light, which is not as bright as this space, I need to make this more subtle, and to create those transitions, I can overlap the colors, and I can also shade over the colors, and I can continue shading, changing pencil direction to capture that volume. Because then I'll take lighter pencil, for instance, pink, and I would shade this way, going over some of the white. And hopefully I'll create volume this way. Also, this space is quite complicated, and again I'll be looking at at curvature. This space needs to recede in space more, so I'm gonna darken this, shading this way, but then it curves out a little bit. I'm gonna change my pencil direction, curves in and out, and so on. The same is true for the neck. In essence, it's a cylinder. I need to think of the roundness of the shape. Besides capturing a very strong shadow under her chin. By the way, most of the time the chin is, the neck is in the shadow. It's much darker than the face. It just happens naturally because, you know, the face casts a shadow onto the neck. But besides copying this curve to describe the, you know, the dark shadow, I also need to think how this rotates in space, and when the person turns, there must be very soft transitions to show dark, light, and dark. So my goal becomes to make those subtle transitions, to create a range of tones, a range of values, and only after that I will go back and start making the texture on her hair, probably the texture on her eyebrows, and so on. This would be my last step. Sometimes when colored pencils become too waxy, like I used a lot of color over here, and it's almost like it's too difficult to apply even more color. I'm thinking after I'm done filling in middle to light tones in the face, I'm gonna step out and spray it lightly with a fixative, let it dry, and I'm going to come back to it and start working on the details. It does make a difference what pencils you use. Basically, it comes down to the softness of colored pencil. If you draw on textured surface, harder pencils work a little bit better. But at the same time, I find that the softer the pencils and the more pigmented they are, the better the result that you are getting. You know, I find it very hard to shade with harder pencils because paper fills in a lot sooner. When I get to this space and I want to apply more color, I can't because it's just so filled in. And that's the thing, you know, working with harder colored pencils. But if your colored pencils are very soft, you just have a lot more leverage to shade continuously and to have a lot of layers to create more transitions between the colors and the tones. And I keep changing my pencil direction depending on the area I'm working on. And usually I end up using a mix of different colored pencil brands. I tend to use harder colored pencils on top of the softer ones when I get into the details. As I keep creating general volume, I like using softer colored pencils first, because you basically can apply harder colored pencils on top of that, but it makes it very difficult to, you know, to apply soft pencils over the hard ones because the paper has been filled in already. When I get to the areas that I marked as very light, but they're not as bright as this area, for example, I simply go back and I shade it lightly. This way it still remains light, but it doesn't compete with my highlight over here. I'm going to do the same in this space, because this is very light, but it just, like, this space is not as white as this. And if I look at these two lights, I can definitely see that this is the brightest and this needs to get a little bit darker. So all I have to do is just to go back and shade over it some, to create this difference in the light. Also, when I want to create the area without any textures you see now, and I want to create volume, I often shade in circular strokes. When I get to this area, it might look a little bit too strong. I go back and shade right next to those edges in small circles. I use a very light pencil pressure and I go over the colors that are next to it just a little bit, and this creates a softer edge and softer transition and tone into the rest of the area. When colored pencils are soft, it's possible to go back and forth, layering the colors. But if you have hard colored pencils, you're very limited with your layering or shading. Once it's dry, I can apply my final layer and do the texture and adjust shapes and values a little bit more if I need to. When I step back and look at it from the distance, I can see that I need to shade over this space a little bit more to make it more brownish and to unify it more so it recedes in space. I also need to work on a few highlights that I see in the hair, probably make a few flyaways, small hair strands to make it more real. I would also add a few hairs in the eyebrows. I'm thinking of adding just a little bit of light in this area. The color of the background always affects the edges and the overall feel for the drawing. When I shade the background, I shade over the edge, not to create lines around the hair that I don't want to have. It needs to be seamless. And I want this to have a sketchy feel. That's why I'm not gonna fill it in completely. Rather, I would just make it more even, going like so.